Okay, time to get ready for the interview with Sabine. Let's see, where's Podcastle? Alright, here it is. Or not. What's happening here? Oh dear laptop, please don't die on me now. Okay, looking better. Okay, today Sabine. My former PhD advisor. So I should probably keep it professional, not ask too many weird questions. Let's see what's gonna happen. Off to the virtual recording studio. And here we go.
The Community Lab. Your podcast that connects professional communication research, practice, and people.
Hi, and welcome to the Community Lab. I'm Danny, your producer and host, and I'm thrilled you're joining me for this very first lab talk. Kicking off the podcast in style, my guest today is none other than my former PhD advisor, Professor Sabine Einwiller from the University of Vienna. I'll admit, being a bit of a free spirit doesn't always make me the easiest person to work with, but Sabine has always trusted me completely. And well, that's worked out pretty well. At least for me. In this episode, we're diving into her scientific career and exploring why combining communication studies with social psychology makes perfect sense. We'll talk about her research on internal communication and the power of employee appreciation, as well as her work on complaint handling, communication KPIs, and, of course, our collaboration on professional communication in the context of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So fasten your seatbelts and get ready for your first lab talk. Whether you're commuting, sweating it out at the gym, or, well, doing whatever else you might be doing right now. Enjoy. Sabine, welcome to the Community Lab. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for the invitation, Daniel.
Sabine, before we dive into your research story and our collaborations, I'd like to properly introduce you to the audience. And for that, I turn to ChatGPT for a brief introduction. So here it is.
Today's guest is Professor Sabine Einwiller, a leading scholar in public relations and corporate communication. She is a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Vienna, where she heads the Corporate Communication Research Group. With over 100 publications, her research spans corporate social responsibility, reputation management, employee communication, and public relations, helping us understand how organizations build trust and maintain credibility. Professor Einwiller's work has been published in top-tier journals, and she's deeply committed to bridging research and practice, making her insights invaluable for both scholars and communication professionals. If you ask ChatGPT, she's a powerhouse in public relations and corporate communication, blending academic rigor with real-world impact. I'm thrilled to have her on the Community Lab to talk about her research and its significance.
Well, that's it. I know that a few things are missing here, but what's your opinion on the intro?
Wow, I wouldn't have bragged about myself in this way. But if ChatGPT says that, of course, it must be correct. It cannot have hallucinated this.
Yeah.
I don't know what I would add. I don't know. Let's talk about it.
We'll figure it out during our conversation.
Yeah.
All right. Good, Sabine. Then let's start with more general questions. Because as mentioned in the trailer, the first two lab talks with you and Francois, they are a bit different. Instead of diving into a single research topic, we are taking a step back to explore your research journey and professional accomplishments. But before we get into that, let's rewind a bit. You actually started out in psychology, right? Before transitioning into communication. How did the shift happen and what led you to where you are today?
Well, yes, as you said, I studied psychology with a focus on social psychology at the University of Mannheim in Germany. And when I was a student there, I worked as a research assistant under the guidance of some great researchers in social psychology. And this definitely stimulated my interest in scientific research. Our research there was broadly on attitude formation, persuasion, and that triggered my interest in attitudes towards brands and companies. Mm-hmm. Well, as part of my studies, I was required to do an internship in an organization. And since I had gotten interested in people's attitudes and was enrolled in some business and market psychology classes, I asked myself how attitudes towards companies were formed and whether companies actually manage and measure this. Well, I did not really know that something like public relations existed.
Okay.
But I was looking for an organization or company where to do my internship. So Mannheim is at the River Rhine, and on the other side of the river, there's the city of Ludwigshafen. And this is actually the location of the headquarter of the largest chemical producer in the world,
really?
Which is BASF.
Okay.
So, it's a huge integrated production site there, and employees that time, I think over 40,000 people worked there. And in the world, there's like more than 100,000 people. So I asked myself, what about the attitudes of people towards this large chemical company, which can look a bit like dangerous, maybe sometimes. So I thought, okay, what do people think about it? So I thought about sending my application for an internship to the company. But of course, since I didn't know public relations existed or a department, I just sent my application letter to the central HR department of this huge company. And, I kind of described what I wanted to do and asked for whether I could do this internship in the department where one studies the image of the company. Mm-hmm. Because that I was interested in. And then, 3 weeks later, I received a response from the HR department with the contact details of the lady at the public relations department who was in charge of a small unit where they measured analyzed the image of the company. And this unit was called communication research. Mm-hmm. This is how I got into the field of public relations. After my summer internship was over, I stayed as a freelancer. And after finishing my degree in psychology, I was hired as a full-time employee there. I still was interested in academic work, and I also tried to work on a PhD thesis alongside working at the company. But I just gave up because I also wanted to enjoy life and not just work every weekend with a PhD thesis.
Of course. Sabine, just one question. So what did you do at BASF?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I said, when we did communication research, and it was a cool little group analyzing, studying the image of the company. We did all sorts of opinion research, surveys, stakeholders of BASF from different areas, also customer surveys, but also about the advertising of the company, about the general image, employee surveys as well. So I just remember riding the bicycle through this production site, which is just amazing. I mean, if you like industry, it's and then go through all these different sites and production sites to interview also employees there. So it was a great time. So in total, as a full-time employee, 2.5 years there. Yeah, but kind of after 2 years, I must say, after I don't know how many surveys and analyses I had done, I got a little bit bored. Okay. And I thought something should change. And I thought maybe internally something else, but I also looked for job ads externally. And this is when I came across a job ad from the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland for a PhD position in a Center for Corporate Communications. And I thought, this is kind of what I do right now. I mean, this is the department I'm working in, and I applied, and well, I was hired, and joined academia and never left.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you've made major contributions to the field of public relations, but also corporate communication. And as the head of the Corporate Communication Research Group at the University of Vienna, you're shaping how we think about these areas. And if you had to break it down, what's the big question that drives your research? So what are you ultimately trying to uncover or explain through your work with your research group?
Well, when I think about the big picture, I'm interested in the effects of corporate behavior, including the communications, when it leads to positive and when to negative effects. And as a communications researcher with a background in social psychology, I am particularly interested in how people form attitudes towards and relate to companies, and how this then manifests itself in their behavior, particularly their verbal behavior, such as complaining when they're dissatisfied or speaking positively when they like the company.
All right. Then I would say let's get a bit more specific, shall we?
Yeah, good too.
Great. So Sabine, the research group you're heading is called the Corporate Communication Research Group, which I was part of several years, obviously. And your professorship is called Public Relations Research. So why Corporate Communication Research Group and not Public Relations Research Group?
Yeah, back then, about 10 years ago, when the research group was established, we chose the name Corporate Communication Research Group to make clear that we focus on the communication of companies and not, for example, political parties, because there's also political PR. But political communication is another large research area at our Department of Communication at the University of Vienna. And we wanted to differentiate that we do research on corporate communication, and my colleagues, they do great research on political communication.
Sabine, you're certainly aware of that many people, tend to use the terms corporate communication, PR, strategic communication interchangeably, which isn't really accurate when you look at the literature. So what are the main differences between these forms of professional communication, Sabine?
Well, needless to say, there are many notions and definitions for all three concepts and other related concepts. But yeah, I can give my view, of course. Corporate communication, my view, is the communication of a commercial organization. You can take a broader view, of course, and also include nonprofit organizations, but I prefer to focus it. Overall, corporate communication as a management function coordinates all internal and external communication to contribute to the achievement of the company's objectives. The goal is to generate and influence knowledge, attitudes, emotions, and behavior of the company's stakeholders, but also to build knowledge for the company itself through analyzing the environments and through closely listening to the company's stakeholders to identify their interests. And the communication activities can be carried out by communication practitioners, internally or working at an agency, top management, or by any other employee.
So like the ambassadors of an organization.
Absolutely. So employees are very important communicators themselves and can certainly function as ambassadors.
What is strategic communication?
Well, strategic communication is broader and also narrower at the same time.
Okay.
It's broader in a sense that the communicative entities can cover the full range of economic and social sectors, aside from companies, also NGOs, government agencies, activist groups, military, even terrorist groups can practice strategic communication.
Awesome.
But it's also narrower in that it encompasses all communication that is substantial for the survival and sustained success of the communicative entity. This is part of the definition by Zerfas and colleagues from 2018, and they continue to define strategic communication as the purposeful use of communication by an entity to engage in conversations of strategic significance to its goals. But there's also other notions of strategic communication out there that see the concept broader. But regarding the different notions, actually, I suggest reading this article by Zerfas and colleagues, 2018, in the International Journal of Strategic Communication.
The listeners will find the reference in the show descriptions.
Great.
Yeah, and then finally, what is public relations?
Strategic communication actually is often used as an alternative term for public relations, but it really depends also, first of all, on the country. In different countries, it's used more or less, and and also on the researchers, which term they prefer. But of course, there's also overlaps. Strategic communication, for example, and public relations. So like in the case of strategic communication, the communicative entity doing PR can be any type of organization or person. So this is very similar. And PR typically deals with also managed external and internal communication activities. And this also includes kind of the communication that is substantial to the survival and sustained success of the communicative entity, so strategic communication. But it's not limited to this type. It also includes tactical, operative communication activities. So it's also broader in that sense. But maybe where it's narrower, and also narrower from corporate communication, is in the demarcation from marketing communication. So while PR is differentiated from marketing communication and advertising, strategic and corporate communication do not exclude marketing communication or advertising or branding.
I want to come back to the corporate communication research group. What have you and your team been working on so far, and what are the core topics you've been investigating?
But broadly speaking, we analyze how companies communicate with their stakeholders. We are particularly interested in the effects of companies' communication activities on their stakeholders, as well as the influence of stakeholders' communicative action on companies. So stakeholders as communicators as well. And for about 4 or 5 years, we've been focusing primarily on employees, that is employees as stakeholders, but also as communicators, and how stakeholders like employees, but also consumers speak up about companies is another focus and an overarching theme. So we did quite some research on stakeholder criticism and complaining about companies. And how companies respond to criticism and communicate in critical situations and crises. A third research area I got interested in when serving as the head of the Austrian Public Relations Ethics Council, which I did for 7 years or so. It's the ethical challenges that emerge in public relations, particularly from like the blurring boundaries between PR, advertising, and journalism. So we did research on that as well.
Yeah, very, very fascinating. What I learned during my bachelor's, it's so funny, and I'm pretty sure it's, theory, and so in terms of ethics, is like in public relations, you don't lie. In advertising marketing, you can't lie. And I think that's very idealistic, of course, but I don't know. I'm an idealist, so I still believe in it, of course.
Very good. Should not lose that.
Sabine, now you mentioned the varying topics you and your team have been investigating. So I'm curious, what topics have been the most interesting ones for you and why?
Well, employee communication fascinates me because employees are such an important stakeholder group, not only as recipients of communications, but also as communicators in and for the organization. And without their dedication and great work, companies just don't function. And to outsiders, they're the most credible sources of information about what's happening in the organization. I also very much enjoyed researching communication in critical situations, crises, and on critical topics. It's the challenging situations that fascinate me, when companies are not loved for what they do, but challenged, and how they communicate then. My first big empirical project on employee communication was actually a combination of the two areas.
Okay.
With my former doctoral student, Christine Kohn, we looked at how employees react to negative media coverage about their employer in a crisis or critical situation. negative news about a company affects employees because of their close ties to the organization and because it affects their workplace, which is certainly an important part of their lives and identity. The information conveyed by the news media also gives employees an idea of how others outside the organization see the company, which also influences their image construction of their organization.
Okay. How did you go about that and what did you find?
We conducted qualitative interviews with employees who had worked in a company that had gone through a crisis. And we interviewed communication managers responsible for internal communications. And we also conducted a large-scale survey among people working in organizations, where we selected people whose employer had been covered negatively by the media. Well, we were initially concerned that it would be difficult to find these people, but we were then surprised that more than actually half of the people in the panel we used for the research stated that they had experienced negative news about their employer.
Okay, interesting.
About a third had learned about the negative event from internal sources, of which less than 20% were official internal sources. The rest had heard about it from colleagues. So it seems that organizations, at least the ones our participants worked for, don't seem to be good at informing their employees about negative or critical events.
Okay.
Also, an important and for us surprising finding was that over 80% of our respondents had been approached by outsiders asking what was going on in their company. And this shows that employees are an important source of information for outsiders. But when do they actually communicate in a way that helps their organization? So we explored when employees show more defensive and then more assertive communication in response to these approaches from outsiders. And defensive includes excuses and justifications, whereas assertive communication means actively defending the organization, explaining the situation, and conveying the organization's official version of the event in order to bolster its reputation. And what we find is when employees evaluated their company's internal communication positively, they had more assertive reactions. And when they evaluated it poorly, they showed more defensive reactions. So this shows that internal communication can make a difference in winning employees as ambassadors for the organization in critical situations. Well, and aside from internal communication, employees' identification with their employer also had a positive effect in how they responded to outsiders.
Okay. And how did your journey in employee communication research continue?
Our research on employee communication got really interesting during the COVID-19 pandemic. This health crisis, with all of its downsides for all of us, it was a great opportunity for research. Because now it was possible to analyze the effects of employee communication in a real crisis situation without any potential memory problems. Our first big study was on the effects of internal corporate communication on employees' job engagement. And we wanted to assess the role of different dimensions of transparent internal communication. So when working on the research model, I just remember sitting on my sofa in the evening, watching television, as this was the thing to do during the pandemic. And there were these news reports about the hardships of medical staff working in hospitals, and then how people were clapping on their balconies to show their appreciation.
Yeah, what a reward.
Yeah, exactly. What a reward. But it's so important to be appreciated. And also, I thought, what about like all the other employees also in, of course, the medical workers? They had it especially hard, but many other people too working in companies. So I thought, we have to include appreciation also in the model. Thus, we differentiated between relational and informational dimensions of internal communications. Relational includes appreciating employees for their support during the pandemic, as well as participation, that is asking for feedback and opinions. And then informational communication comprises communicating the important facts and issues, and this in a timely, understandable, and reliable manner. We didn't have a hypothesis which type of internal communication would be more effective, relational or information. Well, you weren't involved in this research project, Daniel, but what do you think? What's more influential?
I would say, based on my findings from other research projects, I would say, of course, relational communication, where you are supportive, where you show appreciation, benevolence, care. My personal research also would suggest that.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely right. It clearly came out that relational communication was particularly influential for employees' job engagement through its impact on effective commitment. And we found this extremely interesting. And therefore, we started a project on employee appreciation.
And what exactly is employee appreciation and how did you study it?
Definitions of appreciation vary between conceptualizing it as a perception or feeling or as a communicative behavior. We think that both elements are important for defining the construct. Employees' perception of being valued by others, and this is stimulated then by appreciative signals. So both parts are important. And what these signals should be about, we investigated in our research project, which was led by Julia Stranzl and Christopher Ruppel, our colleagues.
Shout out.
And we started out with conducting qualitative research to find out what employees actually perceive as appreciative and what they want to be appreciated for.
Okay. So what is it aside from money, money, money?
that people want to get. Well, aside from monetary and material forms of recognition, which are important and which were mentioned in our research, of course, so gifts, rewards, also a good work environment. Well, but the ways of expressing appreciations were still mainly intangible. They include thanking and praising employees, seeing them, taking them seriously, providing purposeful work. That was an important one too, and development opportunities, and also showing humanity with empathy and compassion. And a finding that was quite surprising and interesting was that it was also seen as a signal of appreciation when the company worked on its image, and thereby the image of the employees who work there. This came up in a focus group discussion where an employee of the public utilities company in Vienna mentioned that he found it appreciative that the organization runs an image campaign that makes waste management look important, sustainable, and cool, and also puts the workers in the positive light. Actually, the utilities company, they have been doing this for about 15 years with like humorous, sometimes provocative messages. We also find that employees want to be appreciated for not just work-related behaviors, but also for their personal characteristics and qualities.
And you also looked, of course, at the effects of appreciation. So what did you find?
Yeah, so we also conducted quantitative research. Jens Hagerstein and Ingrid Wahl were the ones driving this part of the research.
Also team members, by the way?
Oh, yes, of course. CCOM research group members. We conducted a survey among people employed in organizations in Germany to analyze what employees expect and what they, on the other hand, receive in terms of appreciation. And we found that over 40% of our survey respondents reported that they do not regularly receive appreciation from their managers or colleagues, which we found a bit alarming.
Indeed.
Regarding the effects of receiving appreciation, we find that appreciation from managers is particularly impactful for employees' job satisfaction and for their willingness to support their organization. Well, such as serving as an ambassador for the organization. And appreciation from colleagues turned out to be important for organizational identification, so how strongly people identified with the organization, and also for helping their colleagues.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Let's be more appreciative, I would say.
Yeah.
What I also want to talk about, because in the context of employee communication, you've also researched communication in the DI context. So with me, not only with me, but also with me. And this is certainly a critical and hotly debated topic, especially now that the convicted felon that Donald and his weird sidekicks have started a crusade against the so-called wokeness. Since we've been collaborating a lot in this realm, what can you tell us about our DEI research?
Yes, the focus area of our research is communication on DEI. I had the great pleasure of cooperating with you on this topic.
Oh, yeah.
And we started this research stream about, 5 years ago.
Makes sense, yeah.
It was already an important issue when we started our research project, but then the murder of George Floyd happened in May 2020, which prompted many companies to step up their DEI programs. And now we see this anti-DEI movement spearheaded by Robbie Starbuck, putting pressure on companies like Harley-Davidson, John Deere, Walmart, several others who have since bowed to the pressure. And now more pressure is coming from the new US government.
Oh, yeah. But Robbie Starbuck, who is this dude?
Well, he's a right-wing activist, former film producer or TV producer. So,
let me guess, Fox News? I mean, I have no idea.
I don't know. I haven't watched that for sure. So whatever he did, but now he's definitely very active, putting pressure on companies and stimulating criticism.
Awesome. We need those people.
So, but we know from our and others' research, that DEI, communication and activities are very important for employees and have favorable effects. So it's very unfortunate that companies are rolling back their initiatives. Yeah, why don't you talk a bit about our findings?
Okay. You want to switch roles now? Awesome.
Yes. Well, let me ask some questions for a while. Yeah.
Okay. I try to keep it brief. We conducted several studies about DEI communication. The first one was a study with the title Talking Inclusion into Being. And it was a qualitative study based on interviews with, I think, 87 employees in the German-speaking area.
A lot of interviews.
And eventually, what we were interested in was to figure out how does inclusion come into being through and in communication. Interestingly, our findings suggest that particularly interpersonal communication in formal contexts contributes to inclusion. Of course, interpersonal communication with your colleagues, so at the same hierarchical level, also contributes to inclusion, but not as much as communication in formal contexts, such as official meetings or annual appraisal interviews. So that makes a huge difference. What we also found is that mediated communication, such as communication about DEI initiatives and measures via internal newsletters or the internal social media, also contributes to inclusion, but not as much. It's more about informing the employees, but also other stakeholders about ongoing initiatives, but also envisioned initiatives. So it's more about informing and bringing people on board, so to speak, and less about inclusion itself.
Yeah.
I just remember it was 84 people we interviewed, by the way. Anyway, so the second study I briefly want to talk about is the paper I authored alone, but it's the same data set, the 84 interviews. I'm only joking, and the main purpose of this paper was to investigate how the use of humor communicatively constitutes inclusion and exclusion at the same time, which means like inclusion for some people while others are being excluded through and in communication and the use of humor in particular. The findings were that there are like 3 themes or 3 ways how disparaging humor can foster inclusion but also exclusion. So, for example, the first theme I identified is fostering inclusion by reinforcing existing boundaries through mockery, for example. This means that in this case, it was making fun about the superior with a migration background, Middle East, if I remember correctly. And so they made fun of his Oriental background, so to speak. And by doing so, they reinforced an already existing hierarchical boundary. So it's really about reinforcing this boundary. The second theme that I identified is concurrently engendering inclusion and exclusion by ridiculing alleged insiders. In this specific case in the paper, it's about a former refugee, I think from Syria, and one of his colleagues drew a penis on a piece of paper and put the piece of paper on his desk. And the refugee, or former refugee, was a very faithful Muslim. So he took the drawing and went to his superior and complained. The supervisor went to the team and asked, okay, who did that? And they were like, well, I don't know. It wasn't us. And so that means this kind of humor, and it wasn't verbal humor, right? It was like a drawing, so a non-verbal humor, led to a team member being excluded based on his migration background or faith. The third theme that I labeled re-establishing inclusion by making fun of one's own otherness is more about how someone who got ridiculed based on, for example, their ethnicity, uses self-deprecating humor to tackle this kind of exclusion, because humor, or a sense of humor, is usually considered an esteemed social skill. This means that if you take up the joke directed at you and use it to make fun of yourself, it will increase your standing with your colleagues, and you will be re-included in the group, which had previously excluded you with a disparaging joke. Dear listeners, you can find an interesting example in the paper. Enough about me, Sabine. Now it's your turn.
Yes, so we analyzed companies' DEI communication, not only on social media. Actually, first, we looked at the internal kind of backlash in our interviews. So we asked the DEI managers how they experienced kind of internally backlash. So they say that they do experience it, definitely. And so there is overt and covert resistance. They also said that it's often people don't really speak it out, but it's like in more informal communication or also in internal social media, they do criticize, and there is this backlash. Negative emotions, this is often, the reason why people actually do engage in backlash. So because they are offended, they feel their expectations are kind of violated. Mm-hmm. And one way is to voice their anger and disappointment. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Most criticism within the German companies and also Austrian companies, which we conducted the interviews in, they said that the use of gender-neutral language was very much like a point of criticism, and that was kind of the main driver of this backlash. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. From the communications managers we interviewed, we often heard that critics, they emphasize, well, it's not ideology here, what we do, what we should focus on, but we have to focus on work, we have to focus on business. And they also say, like, don't we have any other problems than discussing our language? So this is kind of the typical lines that they heard. And when it comes to the programs only for women, the critics argue that this is unjust and discriminates against men. This is what we see also in other countries, like, Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in this project, also, we focused on criticism voiced on social media, on what was back then still Twitter and Facebook as well. So we conducted this study in 2022. And then in this part of the study, we analyzed the social media sites of large German and US companies. In this time frame of 7 months, which we analyzed, almost all of the 50 largest US companies, which we analyzed, posted at least once on DEI. Of the 50 German equivalents, it was only 2/3 who posted on DEI. Mm-hmm. We were especially interested in the criticism companies received and how they responded to it. Mm-hmm. The user comments, they clearly revealed the contested nature of DEI, as about half of the posts received critical comments. And the US companies received more critical comments to each DEI post, well, which may also be due to the larger audience they have. And the dimension of DEI that received the most criticism in both regions actually was sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. Then posts about gender and gender identity, that they were also criticized often. So at least once in the US in most of the posts, and not as often in the German company posts. Mm-hmm. That DEI is an issue that elicits emotions is also shown by our research. As nearly half of the critical comments were emotional and generally not very constructive at the same time. Overall, as may be expected, the company's ratio to answer that criticism is very low. Only 15% of the critical posts actually were answered. But what we found is that there weren't only critical posts mentioning DEI. So some of the posts that were actually posted under a DEI post of the company were also about the products or the services of the company. So when we exclude such criticism on products and services, the response rate to DEI criticism is even lower.
Surprise.
So then only 7% that actually received an answer, compared to when we only look at those critical posts on products and services, almost a third, about a third was answered. Yeah. So, well, the companies responded mainly to the criticism on products and hardly to the criticism on DEI.
Okay, so like an indicator of diversity washing, more or less.
I mean, that can be suggested, yes. So this appears, and this is the danger if you do that it appears like diversity washing, yeah. But it also shows, of course, that companies struggle to find good responses to criticism on DEI. And it also confirms findings from a previous research that I conducted on online complaining in general, not just DEI, just complaints. And there we find also that criticism other than on products and services is hardly answered or has a very low response rate compared to criticism on products and services.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, yeah, we've been talking quite a long time now, so let's move on because, as you know, this is a podcast where the transfer of knowledge is particularly important. Therefore, I would like to shed some light on the practical application of your research. For example, your research has also touched upon communication KPIs, so key performance indicators. On which one should communication professionals focus? And why is the definition of KPIs generally so tricky?
Well, yeah, I mean, on which KPI they should focus depends, firstly, on the objectives they want to achieve, obviously. And the objectives, they need to be derived from a thorough analysis of the situation the company is in and kind of what their stakeholders need. But an objective that is generally important to reach, and is often also considered a KPI for communications, is corporate reputation. But in fact, actually, I analyzed reputation back then in my PhD thesis. Mm-hmm. Back in 2000, I was concerned with the influence of reputation on trust in electronic commerce, which was the hot topic back then, actually. Mm-hmm. Corporate reputation, what is it? It's a collective perception and evaluation of a company on certain attributes. And it forms when information about the actions and attributes of a company, positive or negative, spread widely. And, especially negative information, as we know, can spread quickly. And this can then also result in something like online firestorms, which can cause considerable reputational damage.
Okay.
Well, this is kind of a more cognitive outcome or KPI.
Mm-hmm.
What's more of effective and what I find important also to focus on is effective commitment. So the emotional attachment to the organization or organizational identification. So these are two closely related concepts.
Okay, so it's about employees here now.
It's actually no.
Okay.
Organizational identification. There's also it's used a lot in employee research, but also in consumer company identification.
Oh, okay.
It's a very strong and important measure also in consumer research, in marketing research. Well, this identification, this very close connection. So what is it? It's kind of this sense of connection to a company and the degree of which aspects of this perceived organizational identity are self-referential and self-defining for the person. And this is actually important in the consumer context as well as in the employee context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And through these cognitive and affective objectives, important behavioral outcomes can be reached. And it is, in the end, it is behavior that's ultimately important for companies.
Yeah.
Because it's the behavior, the supportive behavior that influences the corporate goals. So here, I think a very important KPI is how people want to speak about the company. So positive word of mouth is important. And that's also for different stakeholder groups, employees, customers, any other stakeholder groups. It's an important objective to generate positive word of mouth. Mm-hmm. For employees, for example, another one is certainly job engagement. Mm-hmm. So that's also what we studied. A job engagement is kind of a mix of cognitive, emotional, behavioral components, and it is the positive work-related state of mind, and it's characterized by vigor, dedication, absorption in the work. Maybe another one, a last one I find very interesting also and important is organizational citizenship behavior, which is positive work behavior, and this is for employees again. It's kind of this positive work behavior that exceeds the job descriptions. Mm-hmm. It involves making positive comments about the organization, which is positive word of mouth again, but also meticulously following organizational rules and also supporting coworkers. Mm-hmm. And what we find is that employees who identify with their organizations, they also show more OCB, more organizational citizenship behavior.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. In general, what advice do you have for communication professionals, leaders, etc., based on your research? I suggest you choose two of them.
Yeah, maybe an advice based on our study on employees' responses to negative media coverage. It really clearly shows that employees are very important communicators and that they can also be ambassadors. But they need to identify with the company and they have to have also the right information to share. So, okay, what advice would I have? So first of all, it's important to have a good media monitoring system in place to always know what's being said about the company and how. And then employees need to be informed transparently also about the negative events in a company so they don't have to hear from it about it from the media. To make them ambassadors in critical situations, they also need to know the company's stance on the issue to be able to deliver the right message that helps the company. So what we found is even people who were identified, but if they didn't really know what's going on and what's our stance, they were just defensive and couldn't really help their company in their kind of ambassador role. From our interviews with the internal communication managers, we learned that it can be a challenge to always inform all employees before a negative story reaches the media. Well, but everybody recognized that there's a need to do so. So clear messages about the company's position, on an internal platform like maybe the intranet is important, but in really serious and like time-critical situations, it's also necessary to provide push information, for example, like via email or some other push medium. And then also what's very important is the role of middle managers, middle management. They were also mentioned by our interviewees back then. It's an important way to reach employees, which means that there has to be a good like executive communication. So communication with the executives of the company to keep them well informed so they can then communicate well with their teams, especially on sensitive issues that need explanation.
So here is where the interpersonal communication comes into place, right?
Absolutely. So especially when it's about like critical issues and critical situations, employees, they have questions. They want to learn more. They want to discuss. So this needs dialogue. And where does dialogue happen most is on the team level. And here the managers play an important role. And it's the interpersonal communication. Absolutely. And also, I mean, since identification is important for gaining employee support, identification needs to be strengthened. And this can be done, as we find, through relational internal communication that includes, appreciation. So this is also what we find is that appreciating employees, sending the right appreciative signals, that is very important. And it has to be also done continuously, not just kind of sporadically. Yeah, devoting time to employees, listening to their concerns, demonstrating genuine interest. And that, of course, also is important that the managers do that. But it can also here, I mean, the organizational level, the internal communications managers, they can help. I mean, they can work closely with HR, that there's trainings also, but also kind of stimulate the topics of appreciation and appreciate employees widely. And then also, of course, the managers can have to do their job in appreciating their co-workers.
Yeah. Sabine, before we finish this lab talk with the quick fire round, I'm a bit nosy. What's next for you and your team? Are there any big questions or new areas you're eager to explore? So what's on the agenda for the next few months, years?
I would certainly be interested in analyzing companies' external DEI communication and their strategies for legitimizing their exit, also their stay in DEI. But our main research focus will remain on employee communication. And here I'm interested in how the current DEI controversy and the rollbacks of initiatives, how that is communicated internally and what effect that has on employees. So maybe will DEI supporters speak out? And if so, when and with what effect? Or will the opponents become more vocal now? So now that they see that they have support also from politics. Researching when employees speak up is actually a topic of a project we're working on right now on psychological safety. So we just recently started that. Psychological safety, that means that employees feel able to take risks by speaking up and voicing concerns or criticism without having to fear negative consequences. There's been great research on psychological safety in organizational psychology and management, but not so much in communications. So we want to find out what role communications, not just on a team level, but also on an organizational level plays, and how internal communication on the organizational level can contribute to creating psychological safety.
Great. Yeah, Sabine, before we wrap up this lab talk, we're diving into our quick fire round. 5 rapid questions, 5 spontaneous answers, no overthinking allowed. Are you ready to rumble?
All right. I'm scared.
Okay, you don't have to. Good, then let's go.
The quick fire round.
What's your favorite way to start your day? Coffee, tea, or something else entirely?
Something else.
For example?
It's lemon water. Hot lemon water. I started that about a year ago. It's cool. It's really refreshing. I love it.
Okay, so you recommend it for me, for example, because I'm not a morning person.
Yes. I don't know. I mean, you have to try it. I put honey in it, so yeah.
Which book, academic or not, has had the biggest impact on your approach to research?
Well, I have to think 30 years back which book stimulated my interest in research. Well, I think quite simply it was my textbook in social psychology that I used for the lecture. It contained a lot of cool studies conducted in the field of social psychology, and I thought I want to do this too, so I applied for a position as a research assistant.
If you weren't a scholar, what career would you be in?
I probably would have gone into psychological therapy, becoming maybe more like a counselor or a therapist.
Who would be your dream collaboration partner, alive or from history?
Daniel, what a question. You!
This is what I wanted to hear. So we stopped the question here, so no additional answer allowed. Finally, what's a piece of advice you'd give to someone starting in public relations or corporate communications?
To start, I think it's very important to know what's ethical or not. Like now, I mean, I said that I also researched the blurring boundaries between public relations, journalism, advertising, and so on. So it's really important to know, what is ethical public relations, how to be transparent. Before you said also that you're idealistic, so not to lie. Yeah, I think this is very important to know where the limits are and what not to do, and then to think, okay, what to do.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. That was the quick fire round. Sabine, thank you so much for sharing your insights into your research in the fields of public relations, corporate communications, etc., etc. And of course, not to mention your journey as a scholar and mentor. Sabine, vielen Dank for joining me today. I'm looking forward to seeing how your work continues to shape the field and inspire future research and practice. Thank you so much. Merci.
Thank you so much for having me and ganz herzlichen Dank und tschüss Daniel. Ich hoffe, ich sehe dich bald wieder. Hope to see you soon.
Tschüss und Servus. So, that was the first lab talk. I hope you enjoyed it and took something valuable from our conversation. Personally, I've come to terms with the fact that my Austrian accent isn't going anywhere, and that are just as much a part of me as my name, which, in case you missed it, is Daniel. As we discussed today, employee appreciation isn't just a nice to have. It's essential for keeping employees engaged, happy, and turning them into true ambassadors of an organization. And at the heart of it all, understanding, supportive, and transparent communication. To dive deeper, you'll find 5 relevant scientific publications in the show description, offering more insights into what we covered today. Don't forget to follow the Community Lab on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podcastle, or YouTube, and connect with us on LinkedIn to stay updated. Your feedback is invaluable in shaping this podcast into a must-listen for anyone fascinated by the magic of professional communication. In the next lab talk, I'll be chatting with Professor François Coren from the University of Montreal. He was my supervisor back in 2019 during my first deep dive into the communicative constitution of organization. If you're even half as intrigued by this concept as I was, and still am, you don't want to miss it. Until then, and don't forget, communication is everywhere. It's in what you say, what you don't, and sometimes in a very unexpected drawing. Stay curious and keep the conversation alive.